Okay, strap in. This is going to be one of our longer, one of our denser videos for the year. This video, we're going to introduce the verb. Next video, we're going to introduce the noun. These two are going to be content rich. So, verbs. Action words or ways of describing the state of being. Verbs have 5 categories, 5 characteristics. There are 5 headings under which we can characterize the grammar of a verb, what's going on with a verb grammatically. These are person, number, tense, voice, and mood. Okay? So for every verb that appears in Latin, you can tell me for that verb what its person is, what its number is, what its tense is, what its voice is, and what its mood is. That's the order I memorize these in, these 5. You can do whatever order you want. Wheelock does person, number, tense, mood, voice. What you should do is you should be consistent, because if you always do it in the same order, you won't forget one, you won't get them confused. So I suggest memorizing them either in my order, person, number, tense, voice, mood, or in Wheelock's order, person, number, tense, mood, voice. So what are these? Let's start with person. So person comes in 3 varieties. You can be first, second, or third person. A verb can be. Not very creatively named. First person, the person characterizes who is the subject of the verb. Whether it's I, first person, or we, whether it's you or y'all, second person, or whether it's anyone else. He, she, it, they, Steve is what I often say. That is anyone other than the speaker or the interlocutor. First person, speaker. Second person, interlocutor. It's the other person, the person to whom the speaker is speaking. And third person is anybody else. So, first, second, and third person. Next, we need to do number. And number comes in Latin in only 2 varieties. You can be singular or you can be plural. Other languages, oops, that G didn't turn out well. Other languages have other numbers. Greek has a dual, for instance, for pairs of 2, but Latin only has these, singular and plural. Singular means there's 1. Plural means there's more than 1, right? And this works, in fact, all of these work combinatorially, right? So you can have a first person singular, which is I am a teacher, or you can have a first person plural, which is we are studying Latin. You can have a second person singular, you are a student. You can have a second person plural, y'all are students. You can have a third person singular, he is a student, or a third person plural, they are students. Get it? So these work combinatorially together. Person and number. And what we're going to be learning today is we're going to learn the first, second, and third person singular and plural endings for a particular tense, voice, and mood, right? So I'm going to now introduce to you what tense, voice, and mood are, but you're only going to learn, with a little exception, pretty much you're only going to learn one tense, one voice, and one mood today. But we're going to learn the first, second, and third person endings in both the singular and plural. And these will be important. These will never go away so long as you're doing Latin. This is the basic building block of Latin verbal grammar. Okay, so what is tense? Tense is the most complicated of these because tense isn't just time. It is time, but it isn't just time. Tense is the combination of time plus something called aspect. Now, just the dot on my eye. Now, time is easy to understand. There are 3 times in Latin. There's the present, which is what we'll be doing today. There is the past, which is any time before the present, and the future. No surprises there. There are 3 times, but there are more than 3 tenses because these 3 times can match up with 3 different aspects. Those aspects are, with 2 different aspects, with complete and incomplete, or what the older grammatical books call perfect and imperfect. I'm going to use complete and incomplete because it keeps some of our categories more clearly distinguished. So complete and incomplete. So the tense is, there are 2 present tenses, there are 2 past tenses, and there are 2 future tenses, based on a present incomplete, a present complete. A past incomplete, you get the idea, right? Okay, so today we're going to learn what's called the present tense. And the present tense is present in time and incomplete in aspect. And what that means, what the aspect means is that it's ongoing. This is not being described as something that is finished at the present time. It's something that's described as progressing, as ongoing at the present time. English, we have this present progressive. I am talking. I'm in the process of talking. We also have something in English called the present simple. I talk. Latin doesn't have a simple present, the way English does. So I am talking and I talk are going to be, functionally, they're going to be the same verb in Latin. They're both Latin just has one. So we need to focus on what actually Latin speakers and thinkers are doing. They have a present incomplete tense, and there will be times where it's appropriate to translate that with a present progressive in English. I am talking. There'll be also times where it's more appropriate to translate that into a present simple. They weren't secretly hoping they could express a present simple, but just didn't. They just didn't have that category. That just wasn't a way of talking for them. There'll be times where it makes better sense for us to use a present simple, just I talk, but we need to recognize that in Latin, this is using the present tense means you are doing present time incomplete aspect. What other tenses are there? Well, you can probably guess. There's a future incomplete, I will be running. There's a past incomplete, I was reading. And then there's the complete ones, which we'll talk about later. Things like I had ran, and I have run, and my favorite, future perfect, I will have passed Latin class. Get it? Complete in the future? Well, that comes later. So those are all of our tenses. Quick preview, a foretaste of things to come. These are called the present tense, the imperfect tense, the future tense. Those are the incomplete ones. And then we have the perfect tense, the future perfect tense, and the pluperfect tense. You don't need to know all those today. You need to know there are 5 grammatical characteristics of verbs: person, number, tense, voice, and mood. You need to know what those mean. So you got tense. That's the hard one. Voice is easier. Except that so often people don't teach grammatical subjects quite right. So what voice tells you is whether your subject is the agent or the patient of the verb, right? So a subject is the focal point of the sentence. It's the thing that's often assumed, or at least the thing we're focusing on. That's your subject. But subjects do not always do their verbs, right? Because we have passive voice verbs. So what the voice tells you is whether that subject is the agent doing the verbs, as in the boy bites a pineapple, or the patient of the verb. The boy, still our subject, but He's not biting a pineapple. He is being bitten. The boy is bitten by a dog. Boy is still the subject, but he has changed from being a agent to being a patient. If it helps, you can think of patient like a person in a hospital being operated upon, right? You are the patient. You are not the one doing the verb. You are the one the verb is being done to. And the agent is someone who does things, right? These are both Latin roots. We can talk about those in class. But the voice then comes in two varieties. You have active voice verbs, which is what we're doing today. We're not doing passives today. And you have passive voice verbs. Active voice is when the subject is the agent. Passive voice is when the subject is the patient. And we're going to use that terminology. Subjects are not always agents, whatever your elementary school teacher might have told you. Lastly, we have moods. These are perhaps the most abstract of all of these. There are three moods in Latin. A mood, it tells you how this verb relates to reality, or what this verb is doing in a pragmatic sense, I guess. So, there are three of them. There's indicative, which is what we're doing today. We're actually going to do two of these today. Indicative is the description of the real world. We'll focus there first. The indicative tells you about the world. It is how you indicate things about the world. It's how you inform people about what is or is not the case. The indicative mood makes better sense. You can understand it better when you contrast it with the other options. So, the other verb we'll look at today, the other verbal mood we'll look at today, is called the imperative, as in a command. This again comes from a Latin verb, a Latin root, to order or to command. The imperative mood is how you tell someone what to do. The difference between you are walking and walk. It's a little bit strange. Maybe you might say, you are leaving the classroom. I'm informing you what you're doing. As opposed to leave the classroom, which would be a command, right? There's a third mood that we'll come to much later, and that's the subjunctive mood. And the subjunctive mood is how you express wishes, oughts. It's the would, should, could mood. So it's how you say things like, well, if we have, you are leaving the classroom, just stating this as a fact. Leave the classroom, imperative. And you should leave the classroom. Or if you would leave the classroom, then we can go home, right? So that last one's the subjunctive. Indicative, describing reality. Imperative, ordering people. Subjunctive, would, should, couldness. Unreality, some sort of wish, desire, implied ought. Okay, so, seems like a lot. What you need to know those 5 categories and be able to recite them, but you don't need to know all the different entries within those 5 categories, right? I'm not going to quiz you on remembering what the subjunctive is, right? That's okay. You don't need to know that right now. Here's what you do need to know. First, second, and third person, singular and plural, is the endings we're going to learn today. We're going to learn these for the present, active, indicative. Now, Latin is an inflected language, which means we are going to change the spelling of the verb in order to communicate things about that verb's meaning. English has a little bit of this, but not much. English mostly uses helping verbs, auxiliary verbs, right? The difference between I am running and I will run, right? That's a tense difference, but I make that tense difference by using an extra helping verb, by changing am running, so I run, I am running, I will run. I change the helping verb, whether I omit it or include it, and which one I include. Not so much in Latin. For the most part, Latin is an inflected language, which means instead of adding a will run, we're going to change the spelling. We're going to give it a particular ending. The person endings are O, S, T, mus, tis, nt. O-S-T, mus, tis, nt. So these are going to never appear by themselves, of course. These are endings that go on to a verb. Let's pick a verb. The default verb everyone learns first and most people remember into their old age is the verb to love. Amo, amare. We'll talk about what I'm saying there in a second, but the basic form is o. Now, there's a thing called thematic vowels. We'll talk about it in a second. Don't worry about how I'm getting a couple vowels here. We're getting there. But we're going to recite these endings that you need to learn attached to a verb because it makes the most sense. Amo, amas, amat. I am loving, you are loving, he, she, it, Steve is loving. Okay? I, you, he, she, it, Steve. First person, second person, third person singular. Amamus, amatis, amant. We are loving, y'all are loving, they love. Now, I've translated the present with the present progressive English. Amo can also just mean I love. I love, you love, he, she, it, Steve loves, we love, y'all love, they love. Amo, amas, amat, amamus, amatis, amant. You should recite that 10 times every hour until you don't need to anymore. Doesn't take much work. Amo, amas, amat, amamus, amatis, amant. If you can memorize these, you will be well served. Okay, so let's talk about the few things I've taken for granted that we need to talk about to get those forms. We're doing all right here? We're making progress, okay? We're well over halfway now. There are 5 categories or 5 characteristics of verb that affect its grammar, that tell you something about its meaning and its grammar. These are categories of meaning. There's another way of grouping verbs that has nothing to do with the meaning of the verb, okay? But we can group verbs. In fact, we must group verbs by their spelling. There are 4 ways that Latin verbs, there's a fourth and a half one too, but there's basically 4 ways that Latin verbs can be spelled. 4 patterns of spelling. We call these conjugations. And they just tell you certain features of how you're going to spell. So if you learn a verb is first conjugation or second conjugation, you learn nothing at all about its meaning. If I ask you, would you please parse that verb for me? You don't even need to tell me the conjugation, because the conjugation doesn't affect its meaning. It is a category of spelling. And here's what that looks like. Amo is a first conjugation verb, which means that outside of its first person singular, outside of this one, where it's just an O all by itself, it's going to have an A as its what we call its thematic vowel. So when you heard me recite this, I said amo, amas, amat, amamus, amatis, amant. That is because I used an A there because it is a first conjugation verb. By way of contrast, the first verb you get from the second conjugation in your textbook is debeo. And second conjugation verbs are characterized by a long E. Debeo. So instead of being debeo, instead of being amas, amat, this goes debes, debet. This E right here is our thematic vowel. Debes, debet, debemus, debetis, debent. Note, the thematic vowel, the E, for the second conjugation stays in the first person singular. Debeo, I, o, I, ought. As opposed to, in the first conjugation, ama, o doesn't work. It's just amo. The thematic vowel disappears. There are reasons for this, deep grammatical reasons. They're not worth spending your time worrying about. So what's the takeaway? There are two conjugations that we're learning today. The first conjugation, which is characterized by an A, and the second conjugation, which is characterized by a long E. I say long E because, of course, there's another conjugation characterized by a short E, which will cause headaches for you later. So, when you look in your vocab list on page 6, you'll find there's about 10 verbs. Amo, cogito, debeo, do, ero, etc. You actually can tell what conjugation something is, at least between these two, by just looking at the first word. Amo, first conjugation, because there's no E in front of the O. But the way you're supposed to do this is you're supposed to look at that second entry, amo, amare, and you'll see why when we learn later conjugations. A-M-A-R-E. Amare, that's called the infinitive. We'll talk about that in a second. That has an A in the infinitive, which means it's a first conjugation verb. As opposed to debeo, debere. D-E-B-E-R-E. E in the infinitive. And go look down through the list. Ero, erare, first conjugation. Laudo, laudare, first conjugation. It's an A. Maneo, manere. E, second conjugation. This isn't hard. So, you take the stem, A-M-A, with a thematic vowel, or M-O-N-E, with E as the thematic vowel, and add your endings. O-S-T, mus, tis, nt. To get your different persons and numbers. Let's do one more. Wideo, wides, widet. I see, you see, he, she, it, Steve sees. Widemus, widetis, wident. We see, y'all see, they see. Good? Good. When you make flashcards for these dictionary entry words, and you should make flashcards, make sure you write down all 4 principal parts for the verb. That is, the 4 words they give you in the dictionary entry, those 4 parts are things you'll have to memorize all 4 of for every verb. That sounds intimidating, but there's some very regular patterns. Amo, amare, debo, debere, do, dare, ero, erare. You can probably figure out what the patterns are. You're not actually memorizing 4 unrelated things, except in a few weird cases. In general, you're memorizing 4 very closely related things. Okay, we have a few last loose ends to pick up. One of them is the imperative form. Feel free to pause the video, write down your present active indicative endings, and then come back for this imperative lesson, okay? The imperative works as follows. Imperative is how you command people, and for today's purposes, we're going to say it only exists in the second person, okay? There's no first person imperative, which is pretty true, and there's no third person imperative, which is mostly true. It's less true. But we're going to say for now, there's only a second person imperative. And these are, to create the second person singular, you just leave the thematic vowel as is. So you don't attach any ending. So for amo, to love, if you are going to order someone to love, which is a strange thing to do, you'd say ama, right? Instead of attaching an ending, amo, ama, samat, you just leave the thematic vowel at the end of the stem. Stem, thematic vowel, ending usually goes here. The lack of an ending means it's a command. So if I'm going to order you to, what other vocab do you have? If I'm going to order you to give me something, just one person, da. If I'm going to order you to think, I'm going to say cogita, right? Just the thematic vowel, which you can find by looking at the infinitive. That's second entry in the dictionary. The plural of the imperative is one more ending you have to learn. It's te, right? So amate would be a command to multiple people to love something. Laudate, if you've grown up in a Catholic church, you've probably heard this, or at least singing Latin songs, you've heard this, which means it's a command to multiple people to praise something. You can probably figure out what the rest of the pattern is. Date, servate. I often, when I was teaching younger children, would say takete, which means shut up. All right, one last piece of info. I've referred to a couple times this thing called the infinitive. It's the second form listed in your dictionary entry. The infinitive is the way of turning a verb, this is a verbal stem with a verbal thematic vowel, into a kind of noun thingy. I wish I had better vocabulary. It's a way of nominalizing, turning into a noun. It's a way of creating a verbal noun, which is a noun, but it's a verbal noun, created out of the verb. And it's this RE ending, right? This is why these actually aren't that hard to memorize. Basically all infinitives, with just a few exceptions, have RE after the thematic vowel. So to translate the infinitive, you write to love. It is you ought debes amare, to love canem, the dog. That's not good. That's not good Latin word order. That's English word order. But work with me. We could say something like debes amare canem. You ought to love the dog. Okay? So this is how you make a verbal idea, the idea of the verb, the verbing, how you turn that into a noun. At least it's one way of doing that. Make it something you can refer to. There were a lot of concepts there. You can rewatch the video. You can go back and find little parts. I would suggest you've now watched a 20 plus minute video, which is probably the longest, or at least the second longest we'll have all year. I would suggest now going and reading the textbook. You'll have the paradigms in front of you. You'll have somebody else explaining it in their own terminology. Getting that in multiple media, in multiple forms with different vocabulary is helpful. So before you go and try to parse out my explanations again, read your Wheelock. Take a look at how they explain things. And then, if you're still struggling, and don't worry, you'll all still be struggling a little bit, that's okay. You have a you have a one-on-one tutor who's happy to work with you. You have TAs, Sunday night and Wednesday night, you can go meet with them. And of course, if you are still struggling, you can meet with me to clarify concepts. Okay? Good luck with the homework.